Yeah. Um, that was a lot. Yeah. You're very blunt. I have to say you're very blunt. You don't sugarcoat anything. You just go directly to it, and I appreciate that. I
Oh,
think.
thank you. I think we need more of that, right?
Yeah.
And not for people to, and like it's something which I've always tried to, because I saw it when I was doing the democracy work overseas, that so much time is wasted in people just blathering. And in some cases, that's, yeah, there are absolutely valid cultural traditions where you really need to get to know people first, and that's part of it. But still, at the end of the day, if you're going to make things better, it's because something has been switched from a 0 to a 1 or back, right? That's that's the only reality in the world, is things are either happening or they're not happening. And so in politics, moving things ahead as much as possible, I think, is your main responsibility as a political leader. And it doesn't mean you're right, but what it means is you're putting your ideas out there as sharply as possible. And if someone else blunts them with their own better, sharper idea, then it's my responsibility to say, I have now, using the standards that I believe are the right way to decide what's right and wrong, I've been shown to be wrong. And if you live that way, it gives you the ability to speak bluntly and clearly, but also to immediately apologize and back off if you're wrong, because there's no shame in being wrong if you came to a conclusion based on the best possible work you could do. If you genuinely believe something was correct and then are shown that you weren't, there's no shame in saying I was wrong. I did that multiple times as minister, and people say, well, why wouldn't I apologize? I made a mistake. I was wrong. Like that's literally what I'm sure your parents raised you to do. Why do we suddenly think that when we go outside the house that we would apply different standards, or that we would get better results if we applied different standards? So I think it's the same principle that parents try to raise their children with, of just being honest and being accountable. It applies even more so in politics. And when you do it, people generally as well, they like it. Even if people don't like what I say, I usually get appreciation for at least being clear about what I'm trying to say. And that makes it easier to move things ahead as well, compared to some folks who try and just sugarcoat things to make people happy. The world never changed by keeping everybody happy. It came by people getting stressed, arguing about things, and figuring out how to build things. And that's a process I want to try and continue to encourage.
Yeah. I see you have many books on your shelf. Which one has impacted your life most? And if you could bring it out and show me.
Probably. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's right behind me here. The most. Oh yeah, it is. The most influential writer in my life is George Orwell, and this is a book of his collected essays, which, you know, he tends to be well known for 1984 and Animal Farm, rightly, but he wrote a lot of other incredible books about a couple that I'd highlight. One he wrote, he went and, even though he came from a upper middle class background, he went and worked cleaning dishes and living in poorhouses in Paris and London. And so he wrote a book called Down and Out in London and Paris, which is about his experience living in fairly extreme poverty in the period before the Second World War for a year or so. It's actually when he got the tuberculosis that killed him at a young age from living in unhealthy conditions. And that book resonated for me because my mom came from a really poor family in the north of England, born in 1939, just before the war started. And she herself got TB when she was a little girl. But unlike Orwell, the new National Health Service, the government health service that was born in the UK during the Second World War, it took her in and she was able to get care, and she lived in a sanatorium in the countryside, I think, for 9 months, and she recovered. My mom wouldn't have been alive if it hadn't been for that National Health Service being created in the UK. So it's something that I always sort of think about, that connection between policies and your own life. But yeah, Orwell he also went and volunteered in the Spanish Civil War. And so he wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia about his experiences as a volunteer for the Republican side against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, which taught me a lot about the dangers of extremism, because he was part of a left-wing fighting group, but the communists were more interested in trying to take control of the left than in trying to win the war. So he talks about how the communists actually spent their time undermining the other left-wingers during that fight, and his growing hatred of communism, which ultimately in 1984 is about opposition to all authoritarians, but it's very much directly about Stalin and the Soviet Union. So and he wrote hundreds of essays about everything from how to write good English essays to his thoughts about hunting and the English countryside, and just a masterful writer who I think represents some of the best of the democratic tradition.
Wow, I'll definitely check it out. I think I've heard of him before, but I've never read anything of his, I don't think. But seems like he really impacted you. Seems like he
Yeah,
really did.
so 1984 would be and Animal Farmer, his two big and most famous books. So 1984 is, both of them are super short books. And Animal Farm is even designed to look kind of like a kid's book. It's about a farm where the animals take over. And it's supposed to be the animals are going to run everything equally for everyone. But it turns out that, one of the more famous lines in the book is that some animals are more equal than others. And because it turns out the pigs, as the smartest animals, kind of take over and manipulate all the other animals. And then 1984 is about the world divided into three empires, basically, and everyone living under a form of authoritarian government. And it's about a civil servant in that world. So I'd strongly recommend both of them. They're both easy, quick reads, but very powerful. And if you enjoy his stuff, then the other books I mentioned, you'd probably enjoy them too.
And you work for the NDI, right? What has that? What impact did that have on what you're doing right now?
That's also a question no one has ever asked, which is more central to this current project than just about anything else. NDI, so the National Democratic Institute, was set up by Ronald Reagan back in the early 80s, when they also set up something called the International Republican Institute. And they are linked to the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively. And not in a very extreme way. So obviously, like, as a Canadian, I was still working for them, and there were lots of Canadians working for NDI. And the job was to go around and talk about democracy and helping countries build democratic structures. And this was a replacement of the old American approach, which had been supporting one side or another through military coups and so on. So it was an evolution in American policy, generally very positive. Most of the programs I worked on were, if at the very least, did no harm, which I think is always important in international development work, and in many cases helped. But the big thing that it taught me that impacted the Canadian Future Party in my life as a Canadian politician is I had to work with multiple parties at the same time. So from the first day on my first job with NDI, which was in Bangladesh, I was working with everything from fairly left-wing socialist parties all the way over to Islamist parties. And I've had the chance to work in many countries with people who have won sort of equivalents of peace prizes, and in the case of Mr. Carter, actually the Nobel Peace Prize, and other people who've been sentenced to death and executed for war crimes. So I've met a number of people who've, since the time I met them, ended up being put in court or killed or executed through legal, formal or informal means. And having to work with all those people at the same time was really interesting, because you get totally different perspectives on a given issue. That you'd have some people who would look at everything through a development or economic lens, others through a religious lens. But realizing in the end, as we were chatting about earlier, what it really comes down to is, can people put food on the table? Do they have a roof over their heads? Do they feel comfortable saying what they want in front of their family and friends? And those things tended to be obscured by all those local divisions and partisan divisions. So after working with, I think I worked it out, way over 60 parties in different countries around the world,
Wow.
Different levels, that we have a lot more in common with each other than we think as humans. We spend a lot of time coming up with nonsense reasons to disagree with and divide ourselves from each other. And part of that in politics is because people don't want to do the basic, boring work of building roads, building schools, building hospitals. And it's more fun and easy to get into yelling about how you're a communist, you're a Nazi, the divisive stuff that we've been talking about in this conversation. And so the more that you can try and do to just push people through the systems they work within and live within to wake up in the morning and build rather than knock down, the better. But that's so easy to lose. You look at the States, which was a country which really led the world for a long time in terms of the quality of its government, that despite the weirdnesses of that country, that I remember working with Americans for the first time when I was first starting with NDI and going, okay, I've got to up my game here. These are some seriously qualified, smart people working at a very high level. But now we see that we've got the U.S. government run by Mr. Trump and his friends, and I don't think that it would be fair to describe them as being competent or working at a high level. And it shows how fast a 250-year structure that was, with all of the problems the U.S. has had, but a slow, to use Martin Luther King, the arc of history bending slowly towards justice. It's very clear that when some people choose to bend that arc in the opposite direction, that they can do it. And so the arc of history is not a force that is defined by history, it's defined by human beings. And when we choose to make decisions, from the little decisions that you and I make every day to the big ones that leaders make, it has a difference. And I think it's getting back to remembering that is going to be part of what might save our democracies. And I noticed that in the countries where I worked, that to compare two of them, in Bangladesh, people would use the word Bangladeshi as an insult. Bangladeshis would use it. I remember walking across a street with one of my staff, and the traffic there was terrible. We nearly got run over about 3 different ways. And I remember her going, "Stupid Bangladeshi." And thinking how interesting that was, that you would use your own country as a way of insulting someone else. And then I went to Cambodia, and a country that had just horrible history with a communist government that was supported by the Chinese and Vietnamese initially, killing around a third of the population in just 3 years. And one of the worst auto-genocides in history. But there was a sense of ambition and confidence. And I remember people talking about the great history of Cambodia and how 800 years ago there was a Cambodian empire which built some incredible temples, the Angkor Wat temples, and people would talk about those with pride. And it was pretty clear that was connected to Cambodia having very, very quick economic development when I lived there, and Bangladesh not having very quick economic development. That's since changed. Bangladesh is now doing much better. But I saw that there was a very direct connection between how people felt about their country and how the country did. Because it makes sense, right? Like if, as Canadians, there's only 2 of us right now on this call, but if both of us feel kind of blah, not like doing anything to help the country, that makes a tiny bit of a difference, but that spreads out to other tens, hundreds, thousands of people. That's what makes history change, is people doing things differently. And one of the most basic things that you can do differently as a citizen is decide whether you think your country is worth fighting for or not. As an example, what we're seeing right now with our own independence fight with the Albertans. Too many people on the pro-Canada side insulting the Albertans and saying, "Oh, well, you guys are losers and hicks and rednecks and whatever else." And the Albertan independence people saying, "Oh, well, you're a bunch of lazy, entitled Easterners and just living off the money we send." Just nonsense. But that's the stuff that resonates, right? Because that's easier to talk about, well, you suck, rather than how are we going to build a pipeline? How are we going to make Alberta feel included? But it's a little bit back to what you were saying about being blunt, that if you get into a politics where all you do is try and either be nice or dismiss people, you're not going to get any work done. So consciously building things every day, I think, is one of the key things that I learned from my NDI time.